Today we're going to take a little bit of look at a prophecy update. We'll look at some economic things. I'm going to play a couple clips of Mark Biltz, who Mike referenced earlier, who spoke last night at a prophecy conference in Colorado Springs. I was able to capture some of the video from that. It does relate to the blood red moons. He's the one who's been doing the most work on that particular topic, and since it relates to the passage that we were in last week and this week, we thought we would take a look at it. We see, as we talk about all the time, this convergence of events, and people just aren't obeying the warning signs. This is the train in Spain, I guess, as they say. Here, I'll show it to you one more time. So that's, it took out the reason why the camera goes blank is because it took out the camera. So 80 people dead, almost everybody on the train was injured. Okay, first I'm going to take a look at some economic things. I've been reading a number of blogs following economic things because the Bible says that in the end times there's going to be some pretty severe economic problems. And I think people need to be aware that these things are on the near horizon. This is total federal revenue spending and surplus. Below the line is a deficit. That means the government spent more than it took in. And you can see for many years, the government did pretty good. Now, back in 1913, 100 years ago, they did a couple things. They instituted an income tax, which I think was 1% at that time on the top income earners, not everybody. And they also put in place a thing called the Federal Reserve, which was a group of smaller elite group of men who took control of the banking system in the United States. And what you've seen over the last few years, I say this with some trepidation as someone who represents big banks, including some of the biggest banks in the world on occasion. I'm not their main attorney, believe me. But you've seen a massive transfer of wealth over the last few years to these large banks. You have to pay money to borrow money. You have to pay interest. Big banks are getting it at 0% and using it in the markets and other places to make money. And it would be great if we could all get money at 0% interest. But there's been a massive transfer of wealth. But what you see is, you see here, net surplus deficit, pretty much even. You have some things here, and it's a little hard to see. This is the 40s. And right here you see a change that happened between total public spending is the red line, total federal tax revenue is the blue line. And you can see that those track each other pretty well. They start to diverge right here about 1971. Anybody know what happened in 1971? Yeah, the gold standard was removed. And your money became worth literally only the paper that it was printed on. So that's what occurred at that time. And you can see that the trajectory, now we get out here to 2012, 13, and you can see that there's this massive gap between federal revenues and federal spending. On a blog called The Blurring Platform this week, there was a quote, I think this came from a Hemingway book. How did you go bankrupt? 2 ways. Gradually, then suddenly. Excuse me 1 moment.
What was the blip towards the end of that graph?
Hang on 1 second. Okay, the blip.
Where the bars rise above the the line there.
Well, that was in the 90s when we actually had a little bit of a surplus. Democratic president, Republican Congress in charge of both houses. And people said, well, maybe we ought to have, but it was really kind of illusory because we were really still in a deficit posture if you looked at all the total picture. And this doesn't go and include any of the massive unfunded liabilities. This would be a good point to remind, this is, I mentioned this earlier this summer, called the second half of the chessboard. Old Chinese proverb, and again, I told you it's probably not an old Chinese proverb, but English people like to use that because then people will say, if I say it's an old Chinese proverb, you'll listen to it. If I say it's somebody that I don't know who made up, you won't pay any attention to it because we think, the old Chinese are wiser and they think about things. But the second half of the chessboard, remember, this was a bargain that the Emperor of China, who had supposedly made, he liked chess. And so he said, I'll pay you whatever, this is a fantastic game. So the inventor, he said, I'll give you whatever you want. And the guy says, well, I want a grain of rice. And then tomorrow I want you to double it. And then I want you to double that. And then double that, double that. Well, pretty much by the time you get to the end of the first half of the chessboard, the emperor's thinking, this guy is literally entitled to all the rice in China, and it's not a very good bargain. But that's a picture of how exponentially things increase. If you remember, I think I used this example here. If you take Yankee Stadium and you make Yankee Stadium watertight, because we're going to fill Yankee Stadium with water, which as a person who grew up rooting for the Cleveland Indians is quite a delicious little prospect. Let's say you take a magic dropper and you're going to drop it. So Yankee Stadium is watertight. And we're going to chain Steve Rigoli, we're going to chain him 3 rows from the top of the stadium. And we're going to drop 1 drop of water at second base. And then a minute later, we're going to drop 2 drops of water. So now you have the drop that we had, and plus 2 drops, you have 3 drops. Then a minute later, we're going to drop 4 drops. Then we'll drop 8, and then 16. And so the question is, how long does Steve Rigoli have to get out of his handcuffs before he's a goner? Anybody remember what the total amount was, how long he had? 5 days? Yeah, about 45 minutes. In 45 minutes, Yankee Stadium will be overflowing. Now, the interesting thing about that is, at 40 minutes, the stadium's only 1 or 2% full. And if it overflows at 45 minutes, at 44 minutes, it's only half full. But that's a picture of exponential growth. Bible prophecy works the same way. Go along for a long time, a couple things are fulfilled, but then right near the end, like at the time of Jesus' first coming, about 60% of Bible prophecy was fulfilled in the last week of his life regarding his first coming. It's going to be that way at the time of his second coming. So you're going to see everything beginning into place for Bible prophecy to be fulfilled. If you're a watchman and you're taking note of what's going on, and when things start to happen, they're going to happen really, really fast. That's how it's going to work. It relates to the concept of exponential growth. We're seeing that happen now in the economy where things have been kicked down, the can has been kicked down the road so far that we're now out of road, and there's not much left. The gentleman who writes this blog at the Burning Platform said this: when I critically scrutinize the economic, political, financial, and social landscape at this point in history, I come to the inescapable conclusion that our country and world are headed into the abyss. And you thought I was negative. But I think he's correct. Europe teeters on the brink. They've kicked the can down the road. They've been very creative, but the time has come when the piper's going to have to be paid. In the United States, we see Detroit, which 50 years ago was the city with the highest per capita income in the United States, now in bankruptcy court. And people are fighting whether it should stay in bankruptcy court and whether people should continue to be taxed at ever increasing rates to pay for pensions of people who have retired. Detroit is not alone. There are dozens of other cities, states, municipalities, townships that are facing the same problem because they have not properly funded their pensions. There was a study done in the Los Angeles Times about 2 years ago, and they looked at what would it cost, what would you have to invest today to pay the pension of an average state worker in the state of California. Now, in California and elsewhere, what they do at the end of their working time is because their pension will be tied to their last 3 years, they backload a lot of overtime and that type of thing in their last 3 years so they get a larger pension. But there are people, I know them personally, that have gone to work for the state of California at the age of 22 or 23, and at 53 or 54, they've retired on a full pension, and because of their position, maybe a supervisor in a law enforcement agency or something like that, they're drawing a pension of $125,000 per year for life. And retiring at the age of 53, with life expectancies what they are, they work 30 years and they're expecting a pension for 40 years. Now the math does not work out, but what do you think was the amount of money, it's called present value, what you have to invest today to have a stream of income to pay somebody a pension of say $125,000 a year for the rest of his life? On average, the average amount of pension for a state employee is $2 million in the state of California. That's also true other places. Now, some places where they don't have to pay, the employees have to pay into a fund, it's not as much. But I think it doesn't take too long before you realize that this is an unsustainable system. And there are estimates that and Social Security is the same way, Medicare is the same way, almost all public employee pension plans are underfunded. I think Ohio is actually in a pretty good category in that regard. Illinois is 46 or 50% behind what they need to have to fund current pensions. And you can't continue to tax people more and more and more and more to pay for people that aren't providing services. In Detroit, you can look at that government spending doubled over the last 50 years or so. And do you think people are getting twice the services from the city of Detroit that they were getting 50 years ago? And the answer is no. Right now, if you're in Detroit and you call the police, you can expect an average wait of 58 minutes before the police come for any type of call. That's not a lot of incentive for people to behave correctly if they're doing something incorrectly. 40% of the streetlights don't work. But this is something that's going to be happening more and more to other cities and municipalities as things go forward. At Zero Hedge, they said this: to put this into perspective, the average reader can understand, talking about the increase in government spending, can think of gross domestic product as a household spending. The family depicted above has to borrow each year in order to maintain its spending level. Imagine the condition of your family if you borrowed 6 times the amount of incremental spending each year. 6 times the amount of incremental spending each year. Then imagine the condition of your family after 40 years of continuously increasing your debt level substantially in excess of your income. And this is what the government has done. In order to get some economic growth, the government has had to spend 6 times more money than it used to. So for every $6 that it spends, there might be $1 of benefit to the economy. I think you can see that it doesn't take very long before you're spending the $6 to get a $1 benefit. It doesn't work. Now the problem is that borrowing costs are going to go up. And this is true all over the world. I mean, China is on the brink of some major, major problems. They have built massive ghost cities. They currently have in place the ability to transfer about 300 million people from rural farms to cities. Now, the reason they did that was because they thought that people would be more economically efficient in cities. So if they moved them to cities, there would be more economic growth. But now I've seen, I think I saw it on 60 Minutes, I saw a picture of a mall about the size of Polaris, maybe a little bit bigger, where there was one little toy store open. And the guy said, well, nobody ever comes by. China is also at the risk that about 20% of its land, or I'd have to don't quote me on this, but it's somewhere around 8 or 9% of its land becomes unfarmable in very short periods of time because of pollution. So while people are growing things on farms, nobody would dare eat that stuff because it will kill you because of heavy metal poisoning and that type of thing on farmland, which means that China pretty soon won't be able to feed hardly anybody because of the contamination of its farmland, and it will look elsewhere for people to provide the food that it needs for its citizens to stay alive. So we see here, this is the Federal Reserve, federal debt, total public debt as a percent of gross domestic product. So you can see that back at the beginning of the collapse in 2008, it was about 65%, 63% of federal debt to gross domestic product, which means gross domestic product is about 15 or 16 trillion dollars. So about a little over half of that was the ratio of federal debt. So there's about $8 trillion in federal debt. Now you can see we've gone the other way, where we have more federal debt than we do gross domestic product, which means that if everything done in 1 year was to pay off the debt, we would still have a deficit. That's not a good position to be in. And there's no end in sight. Now, things have gotten a little bit better, they say, over the last short period of time, which means we're only borrowing, we're drowning slower, I guess is the way you should look at it. Here's a chart of government debt per capita. Okay? Goes from 18,000 here to 44,000 here. Now, what are the countries? Well, Spain is the one at the lower end, and the United States is the one at the higher end. Feel better about the United States economy relative to Spain right now? Some say this is not just a momentous or a fortuitous screen capture. This is actually Mr. Bernanke's position most of the time as he thinks about the economy. He hopes that something will happen. But God said that this is going to happen in the end times, and I'm just saying that as you see these things come to pass, as you see these things happen in conjunction with all the other things that are happening, if you're discerning, if you're a watchman, if you're paying attention, if you're looking at the Word of God and what the Word of God says is going to happen, you ought to be sitting up and taking notice and saying, something may be ready to happen, and I need to get ready. One of the ways we do that is get back into the Word of God. This was a clip that I saw at this prophecy conference. I thought I'd play it. These are Chinese Christians, and I think it's obvious what they're getting. Take a look at this. getting Bibles. Oh, that we would react to the Word of God that way. You never realize how precious it is until you don't have it. Well, let's take a look at the Middle East. And then we'll take a little look at Mark Biltz at the Prophecy Conference and some other comments associated with that. Syria is still a major problem. The refugee crisis is now becoming a world problem as people think that, as you can see from this, the London Guardian headline the other day, 8 officials say that the population flight is becoming permanent. And this is a picture of a refugee camp in Jordan. Here's an updated map with the number of registered refugees, 100,000 in Egypt. This is from Syria. 640,000 roughly in Lebanon, 500,000 in Jordan, 400,000 in Turkey, 162,000 roughly in Iraq. Internally, about a third of the Syrian population has been displaced out of their homes. I mean, imagine that here. That would be in the Columbus area, 750,000 people out of their house. This is devastating. And the problem that's having is they estimate that this number will be over 1 million by the end of the year in Lebanon and in Jordan, and close to that in Turkey. And what's happening is that those refugee populations, and you can see this is Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey. You can see the increase in those refugees has gone up tremendously since December of 2011. And it's only going to continue to increase as the war continues to go on there. This is having a tremendous destabilizing effect on the governments in Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. Just having that many people. This is the Za'tari refugee camp in Jordan. September 2012, they had about 2,500 shelters at that location. By April of this year, they had almost 30,000 shelters at that location. And that was the picture that was on the front of the London Guardian the other day. Look at the sea of tents, huts, whatever people are living in. There's probably 250,000 or more people living in this particular refugee camp. They have to bring in, I believe it's over 300 water trucks every day and 300 sewage trucks to take out what the water becomes. Every day, round the clock, 24/7, it never ends. This is the world that we live in today. Now, you can go to Israel and you can be 30 miles away from there and not even have a clue as to what's going on. Iran wants to maintain this arc of influence in Syria, and they will do everything that they can. And this was a report from the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs that Iran is working out its plan to take over Syria. By the way, they're funding things. They're funding Hezbollah in Lebanon. This is a picture of the new president of Iran, a man who You heard the news media. He's a moderate. Oh, good. We don't have Ahmadinejad anymore. Or I'm mad for jihad. We used to call him Ahmadinejad. Now, Rubini, I think is his name. When he gave his speech accepting the presidency, he thanked the 12th Imam. He's a 12er. He believes in a coming Mahdi. He believes that creating chaos will bring the Mahdi, the Muslim Messiah, back to life. He's currently in a well in Iraq, and he will come out of that well, and he will lead the armies to Mecca, back to Iran, eventually on Jerusalem. Now, the Shiites believe that, and guess what? The Sunnis believe it also. So Syria and those areas are a major problem. Egypt, again, there was a report yesterday that well over 100 Morsi supporters have been killed by the Egyptian troops in the past couple of days. And there are massive protests both for and against the Muslim Brotherhood guy Morsi. But Egypt's military is sort of taking the position, well, we're just going to go in and kill them. And at the same time, our government says, well, it's not really a coup that happened. It really is a coup. You can say it's not a coup, but it doesn't make it not a coup. It was a coup. But what will happen in Egypt? Egypt will be destabilized for some time. A number of us went on a lake on Tuesday. I don't have any clip. I haven't had a chance to look at the audio to see if it was even, if it recorded well. But we did have an opportunity to hear a speech by Caroline Glick. And it was a tremendous speech. She was, surprisingly, she was optimistic, I think, towards the end of her speech. And I'm optimistic too. It's just I think I'm optimistic for a different reason than she is. So it was kind of neat. We went out to eat and she sat down at the table next to us, so we went over and talked to her. So Mike Clapham said, now, how hard is it for you, John, to sit here through the whole dinner and not go over there and talk to her? And I said, harder than you can imagine. Turkey at the same time is having a problem with a group called the PKK, and some of its offshoots, and they are Kurdish rebels in the border regions between Iraq, Iran, Syria, and Turkey. They're the offspring, the ethnic group we knew biblically as the Medes. It's the largest ethnic group on the planet that does not have its own country. They want their own country. And so they're being very destabilizing in the Syria-Turkey border region right now, and causing a lot of problems for the Turkish government. Who knows what will happen there. Israel, here's just a short clip of prayers, Friday prayers on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem just about a week ago. Allah is greater, let America be destroyed. This is an imam preaching on the Temple Mount. Allah is greater, let America be destroyed. Allah is greater, let France be destroyed. This is the religion of peace. Allah is greater, let Rome be destroyed. I think it should be the religion of pieces. They want everything in pieces, not in peace. Let America be destroyed. And he goes on to, as any good preacher would, to emphasize his points. He repeats them over and over again. He doesn't use alliteration or anything, but I think you're getting the point. And he talks about how we're ready for the caliphate to be here. The caliphate that will take over and rule the Middle East and the world. Leave Muslims alone because you messed around a lot in Syria. Before that, Afghanistan, Iraq, and he goes on. You get the point. It's all our fault. A U.S. general has said that America pays a price every day due to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I don't think he understands. There's also an American general, I think it's the same one, who also said that Israel is going to attack Iran sometime very soon. That will be a world changer when that happens. This is a letter from Ashton, can't remember her first name. She is the EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs, writing to the European Union government constituencies saying, don't buy anything that's made in the West Bank, in the settlements by Israelis in the West Bank, because it's evil, it's bad, you shouldn't buy that. Never a word about the Palestinians and what they do, it's always the Jews. But then this is, this vote, or this here, Netanyahu said this week that he would be willing to give up 86% of the West Bank as part of a settlement with the Palestinians. And that they were going to release every prisoner, every terrorist that was in prison in Israel that had been there prior to the Oslo Accords being signed in 1993. Now that'll be voted on by the cabinet. I believe the cabinet's going to approve it, but it may be put up for a referendum. But Israel's ready to make peace, and I want you to remember that what I've told you is that I believe that Ezekiel 35 through 37 prophetically describes a two-state solution in which Israel would give up the area known as the Mountains of Israel. I believe that that will be a temporary solution. I don't believe that that's a peace agreement that is the beginning of Daniel's 70th week. I don't believe that's the treaty with the Antichrist. But I believe that Israel is at the place, and you see, I mean, who's been more hawkish than Benjamin Netanyahu over the years? And now Benjamin Netanyahu is talking about giving up 86% of Judea and Samaria as part of a peace agreement. Now, whether the Palestinians will accept it or not, I don't know. I personally think that they will. I think I see it in Ezekiel 35 through 37. You can look at it. I know people I've talked to, they think I'm crazy, that would never happen. Never happen. And I'm saying it'll happen, but it's only going to be for a short time because the Palestinians will misbehave, start engaging in terrorist acts, and I believe that will be the trigger for what will follow the Psalm 83, Isaiah 17 war. I think that's how that gets kicked off. Now, but this goes against the mandate for Palestine. This is what Israel was supposed to look like back in 1922 or 1920. It eventually, the yellow area was given over to the Arabs. But originally it was supposed to be all of the land of modern day Israel, the West Bank, Gaza, and Jordan. It was supposed to be a Jewish state, but it's not. To follow up on what Mike was talking about with regard to the feast. The feast were dress rehearsals for what was going to come. And as Mike said correctly, for over 1,400 years, the Jews practiced sacrificing the lamb on a particular day, at a particular time, in a particular sequence.
I can tell you right now, if you do not know the biblical calendar, you are going to miss a lot of very important things that you're going to see. As a matter of fact, in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 1, it says, "To everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under heaven." Do you think God has purpose things on this earth? Then he has a time and a season for it. So what time is it? Well, the next region of Genesis, after signs, it says, was for seasons. Now, what do we think of when we think of seasons? Winter, spring, summer, fall, right? But you know, this is a wrong translation. That is not the correct word. The Hebrew word here is moed, and it's translated into English not only here as seasons, but another place, the same Hebrew word they translate as seasons here is translated in Leviticus 23 as the word feast. Now, think about this. Here you have one Hebrew word. It's translated as seasons in Genesis 1:14. The same word is translated as feast in Leviticus 23:2. One of them, I think of food. The other one, I think of winter, spring, summer, fall. Both those are wrong translations. This is why if you really want to understand the Bible and biblical prophecy, you've got to know a little bit about the Hebrew mindset. You've got to know some of the Hebrew words, because to have one word mean food, and then also winter, spring, summer, fall, you can see how that's kind of dumb, right? So what is the correct Hebrew or English translation for that word? It's a divine appointment. So in other words, in Genesis 1:14, God says, I created the sun and the moon to send signals on the divine appointments. All right? It's like God has a day timer. How many of you have a day timer? All right? So here, this is God's day timer. He has divine appointments scheduled. All right? Now, how many of you believe in divine appointments? Guess what? They're scheduled. When you're on the biblical calendar, it's like, why would I not want to be there? How many of you want to meet with God? When you think about this, when the Shekinah glory was in the Exodus, the pillar of fire and the pillar of cloud by day and by night, does that mean God wasn't in China? Does that mean God wasn't in South America? No, but he was there in a very special, significant way. This is why we want to understand God's divine appointments, because on those days, God is there in a special, unique way, different than any other time. So this is why we want to connect and have a better understanding of God's day timer and the feasts. In Psalms 104, God states that he appointed the moon specifically for the divine appointments, or the moeds. And the problem with English translation is that, again, they use the wrong word, using it as seasons. It's in Psalm 104:19. It says he appointed the moon for seasons. No, he appointed the moon for his divine appointments. That's when he appointed the moon. Well, we need to realize Passover is one of the feasts. Okay? It is a divine appointment that God had scheduled in his day timer. That's why in Revelation it said he was slain from the foundation of the world. God determined from the foundation of the world when his son was going to die. He even determined what songs were going to be sung at his funeral. That's why David wrote the Psalms, because that was their hymn book. Matter of fact, it says they sang a hymn at Last Supper, went over the Mount of Olives. I can tell you the words to that song. You have the words to that song. They would always sing the Hallel, Psalm 113 through Psalms 118. Psalm 118 would have been the last hymn before he was betrayed and rejected. And what are those words? This is the stone the builders have rejected. It's become the headstone of the corner. So God had divinely appointed these times. So, with that in mind, I want you to realize the feasts of the Lord really are divine appointments when God had predetermined when he's going to intersect human history. Now, let me ask you something. What would happen if you lost your day timer with all your important contact information and your scheduled appointments? Okay. And if we don't understand God's day timer and his appointments, we're going to be lost. What if you lost it even and you didn't even know it until at the last minute it's too late? Oh my goodness, where's my appointment book? I can't find it. You're in trouble. Now, how about if your competitor was so mean, he followed you around, and when you set your day timer down, he stole it. Because he wanted to go to your customers and steal your customers from you. Well, the devil is kind of like that. He took God's day timer away from us. And I want you guys to know it's lost, and I want you to get it back. And that's why I'm speaking here tonight. Now, here's another scenario. Let's say you wanted to meet someone, but they live on the other side of the world. And you knew, man, what are the chances of me ever getting to meet that person? But let's say you go to the airport and you have to wait for a couple of hours for a layover. And unbeknownst to you, that person you wanted to meet is at the next gate and you don't even know it. Wouldn't you like to have someone come and tell you who knew both of you so you could make that connection? Well, that's what I want to do tonight, is make that connection for you guys. So what we need to do is we need to be on God's time clock. So I got a picture here of a little time clock or a calendar. And really, what it's all about, God has Israel as the timepiece, and the Moedim, the feasts, are like the hands on the clock that go round and round. Think of time as circular rather than linear. We need to be aware of the biblical calendar. But here's the problem. As many of you know, the Muslim calendar is based totally on the moon. This is why Ramadan will be in December, another year in July. It rotates, all right? But God commanded that Passover always be in the spring, all right? So the Muslims only follow a lunar calendar. The pagan calendar that we use, by Julius Caesar, and then Pope Gregory modified it, okay, is a pagan solar calendar. It's totally based on the sun. But if you remember in Genesis 1:14, God said, let them, both the moon and the sun, be for the appointed times. Only the Torah has the biblical calendar that is based on both the sun and the moon. We add one day every 4 years for our leap year. On that calendar, they add an entire month, 7 times over 19 years, because it's a lunar solar calendar. It uses both. Now, here's the thing. I used to live right here close to Colorado in Garden City, and that's right where the time zone changes from Central Time to Mountain Time. Everybody had to have 2 clocks, because you would live in one time zone, you could drive across the street, and it's an hour later, and that's without traffic. And I'm from Seattle. I know what that's like. But so if you're going to call somebody in another time zone, if you want to make an appointment and you want to meet with somebody, you have to agree, okay, whose time zone? Like if I do a radio interview there in Florida and I'm in Seattle, they say to call at 9 in the morning. It's like, okay, is that your time or my time? That's 6 in the morning, my time. So if you want to connect with someone, you have to be on the same time zone. You got to make sure you're on the right calendar, you're on the right clock. Well, when it comes to connecting with God and having his special presence, you want to connect to the biblical calendar. Now, in Zechariah chapter 8, verse 19, listen to this verse. And we go ahead and put up this next clip. It says, thus saith the Lord of hosts, the fast of the 4th month, the fast of the 5th, the fast of the 7th, and the fast of the 10th shall be to the house of Judah joy and gladness, cheerful feast, therefore love, truth, and peace. Now let me ask you something. When it says the 7th month, do you think it's talking July here? Not at all. This is a prophecy. So if you're a prophecy student, right here he's prophesying that these 4 fasts that are all tied to the destruction of the temple, he says they're going to be turned into days of feasting and rejoicing. And actually the word is moed. But guess what? If you don't know on the calendar when those days are, how are you going to know when that prophecy is fulfilled? There are things that are happening in Israel, even over the last few years, that Christians were totally clueless, the prophetic significance, because they have the wrong calendar. You've got to look at God's calendar. And I'm going to give you some examples here in just a minute. This fast of the 10th month, let me show you how important it is to God. In Ezekiel 24, verse 1 and 2, it says, again, in the 9th year, in the 10th month, there it is, the 10th day of the month, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, write the name of this day down, even this very same day that the king of Babylon set himself against Jerusalem this day. If this day was so important to God that he said, you write this day down, I don't want you to ever forget it. It's going to be in the Torah for all eternity. This day is important to God. And I think if this day is important to God, it should be important to us. Especially when he prophesied something was going to happen on the 10th of Tevet. Well, if you don't know when the 10th of Tevet is, how do you know that prophecy's been fulfilled? How many of you ever heard of the 9th of Av? How many of you have never heard of the 9th of Av? Okay, bad day. The 9th of Av, remember the story how these 10 spies brought a bad report, but Joshua and Caleb brought the good report? That happened on the 9th of Av. Now, because the biblical calendar doesn't line up with ours, sometimes it's in August, sometimes it's in July. It'll bounce back and forth. Well, guess what? Because the spies brought the bad report, that day has been cursed throughout Jewish history. When Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the temple, it was on the 9th of Av. 600 years later, when Rome destroyed the temple in 70 AD, same day, 9th of Av. In 1290, all the Jews were kicked out of England on the 9th of Av. 1492, all the Jews were kicked out of Spain on the 9th of Av. World War I started on the 9th of Av. Hitler's proclamation to kill the Jews was on the 9th of Av. In 2005, they evacuated the Gaza Strip. Sunset of the 9th of Av. They rejected the land the same day the spies rejected it 3,500 years ago. The Lebanon War. It started on the 17th of Tammuz. That's the day they worshiped the golden calf. That's the same day Nebuchadnezzar stormed through the northern walls. And it's the same day the missiles came through the northern border of Lebanon. But if you're not on God's calendar, when you're reading the news and you see these, this is why I like Bill Koenig's book and his work with Eye to Eye, kind of lining up the events that are happening. If you're not on God's calendar, how are you going to connect these dots? This is why it's so important.
What I also learned over this past week, listening to Mark Biltz, talking about what was going on, it says, remember the Last Supper with Jesus and the disciples, and it says what did they do? They sang a hymn, and then they left. Now, until I listened to that this week, I had no idea what the hymn was. Now, as a brethren, you might think it was "Blessed be the tie that binds," but I don't think that was written back in those days. That's brethren tradition. But what Mark Biltz said was they sang from the Psalms. And there were sections of the Psalms that were sung on Passover and in preparation for Passover. In one of those songs that they would have sung, and he said, imagine the 1 to 2, Josephus said 2.7 million people gathering in Jerusalem for the feast. Imagine all these people being there to engage in the same ritual of sacrificing the lamb and singing the same song. And look at what one of the songs that they would have finished with in one of the Hallels, which is Psalm 118. Understand, this is sung by thousands of Jews on the same day, at the same time, during the same feast, every year. And imagine, look at what this verse says, Psalm 118. The sound of joyful shouting and salvation is in the tents of the righteous. The right hand of the Lord does valiantly. The right hand, and this is at the time Jesus would have been being lifted up on the cross. The right hand of the Lord is exalted. The right hand of the Lord does valiantly. I will not die, but live and tell of the works of the Lord. The Lord has disciplined me severely, but he has not given me over to death. Open to me the gates of righteousness, I shall enter through them. I shall give thanks to the Lord. This is the gate of the Lord. The righteous will enter through it. I shall give thanks to you, for you have answered me, and you have become my salvation. And then listen to this. The stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. This is the Lord's doing. It is marvelous in our eyes. This is the day which the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. This was the day that the Lord made. The lamb slain from the foundation of the world. God, this was not plan B for God. Oh, they rejected my son, and now I have to go to plan B and have him killed. It was not plan B. This is what God had planned for a particular day in Jerusalem from the creation of the world. He knew the day. He knew the hour when all of this would come. And so what he did was he gave feasts to his chosen people to practice dress rehearsals so they would understand exactly what was going on. Oh Lord, do save, we beseech you, Lord, we beseech you, do send prosperity. Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. We have blessed you from the house of the Lord. The Lord is God, and he has given us light. Bind the festival sacrifice with cords to the horns of the altar. And so Jesus would have been bound to the cross while the priest was binding the sacrifice to the horns of the altar in the temple at the same time. There should be no mistake as to what happened. And it just didn't happen to work out that day. It happened on the very day that God had planned thousands of years in advance from the beginning. We know that at the time of the end, the fall feasts are going to be fulfilled at Jesus' second coming. The Feast of Tabernacles, their booths. The scapegoat, that's from the Day of Atonement. Rosh Hashanah, the Ark of the Covenant, the altar where the blood was spread on the mercy seat when the Ark was still in the temple. And then Rosh Hashanah, the Feast of Trumpets. Then this, remember we read this last week, then God said, let there be lights in the expanse of heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be signs and for seasons and for days and years. Then the Lord said, let there be light, and they to be for signs. God put them there for a reason. Satan corrupted them. And I think the church has been so fearful of the corruption that they're afraid to look at what's going on in the heavens. And God put them up there for a reason. Jesus said, there will be signs in sun and moon and stars. Now, so if you're a good disciple, should you pay attention to what's going on in the sun, moon, and stars, or not? Yes. The fact that it's been corrupted by people, and we mentioned this last week, that there are these blood red moons that are coming, these tetrads. They've happened in past history, but the interesting one is this one, 15 days after the blood red moon, and these are associated with feasts. You have the Feast of Passover. The first day of Passover will be a blood red moon. 15 days later, there's an eclipse. Then the first day of the Feast of Tabernacles, Sukkot, there'll be a blood red moon. This is next year in 2014. Then 15 days later, eclipse. Then the next year, you'll have an eclipse 15 days before the blood red moon on Passover, and 15 days before the blood red moon on Sukkot. There's a pattern there. And this is a very unusual pattern. It's happened back around 67, 68, when Israel took Jerusalem. It happened around 1948, when the Jews came back to the land of Israel. If you go to the NASA website, you'll find they've listed all these things, and Mark Biltz went and looked, and he found that on God's calendar, there are these blood red moons, lunar eclipses that take place April, October of 2014, April, September of 2015, that coincide with the Jewish feast days. One thing that you may have noticed recently, there was what was called a supermoon. I remember going to work one morning and I thought, that's really big. It was the moon. I mean, it was like filling the sky. Well, you should know that now this last blood red moon on Tabernacles, Feast of Tabernacles in 2015, will be in Jerusalem, by the way. So you have the tetrad, you have the 4 blood red moons happening, 4 lunar eclipses, all happening on Jewish feast days. And what do you think the odds are that that last blood red moon is going to be a supermoon over the city of Jerusalem? It is. Here's just a clip of Mark Biltz speaking last night. I'll play a little bit of this.
Jerusalem and a picture of a moon. Got to make it a supermoon here. Let's make it a little bit bigger. Guess what? The last one that is seen in the Feast of Tabernacles 2015 is just that. So here on Tabernacles, everyone is in their little sukkah looking through the branches at the stars, and they're going to see this super blood moon over Jerusalem. This is crazy, man. Now, here's the thing. Here's a quick overview of the 7 feasts of the Lord. Leviticus 23, the Lord died on Passover. He was buried on unleavened bread. He rose on first fruits. Pentecost happened on Pentecost. He fulfilled the spring feast to the day of his first coming. How many of you believe the Lord is the same yesterday, today, and forever? Okay, if he fulfilled the spring feast to the day of his first coming, he'll fulfill the fall feast to the day of his second coming. I don't know the year. I don't set the dates. But the events, and so I have only about 19 feast DVD sets left on my table. But if it's like 6 hours of teaching, going through all the feasts that I just went through here in about 45 minutes or an hour, with the book that goes with it's only $25 for 5 DVDs in the book. But you can also order them online. Also, we do have biblical calendars on our website. If you go to our website, we have biblical calendars. We're not trying to make a lot of money. They're $5. Okay? And then we just have another one that's a special one that we just made for $10 where we have all the eclipses posted on the calendar. And it's incredible. They'll be delivered this next week, so we'll have those available in about a week. But listen to this. This is 1 Thessalonians 5:1. It says, concerning the times and the seasons, and when you hear seasons here, what are you really thinking? The divine appointments. It says, you don't have any need that I write to you. Why does he need to write to them? Because 1 Thessalonians 5:2 and 4, it says, you know perfectly well that the day of the Lord comes as a thief in the night. But listen to this next verse. It says, but you, brethren, are not in darkness, that day will overtake you as a thief. You have to read things in context. Everywhere he says he comes as a thief in the night, it's to the foolish virgins, not the wise virgins. It's to the evil servants, not the wise servants. It's to the sleeping church of Laodicea. Because the sleeping church doesn't know the times and the seasons. They're not on the right calendar. Now let me show you something here. How many of you heard about Comet Ison coming? How many of you have not heard about Comet Ison? Okay, and this is not theory. I'm not talking about Nuribu or any of that. I'm talking, this is fact. I only deal with facts.
And what the facts are about Ison is that it's a comet. It's going to be visible later this year. It is also called S1. And they really worked hard to come up with that name. You can go to the NASA website and you can read about that. And this is an article I clipped off the NASA website this morning. Comet of the Century. It's written earlier this year. And listen to what the NASA website says. As 2013 unfolds, the comet is still very far away, near the orbit of Jupiter. That's why it looks like a speck. But for an object at such extreme distance, it is actually very bright, says Batans. The comet's glow suggests that it is spewing gas and dust from a fairly large nucleus in the 1 to 10 kilometer range, estimates Matthew Knight of the Lowell Observatory. Now this. On November 28, 2013, this dirty snowball will fly through the sun's atmosphere little more than 1 million kilometers from the stellar surface. If the comet survives, and a big if, it could emerge glowing as brightly as a full moon, briefly visible near the sun in broad daylight. The comet's dusty trail stretching into the night sky could create a worldwide sensation. The tail would be somewhere around 40,000 miles long. It would be visible at night. This is a depiction of what it might look like flying by Jerusalem on November 28th, 2013. Now, so what, right? We've heard, all these comets come and go. There was Hale-Bopp and the one named after the Japanese guy, whatever that one was, that fizzled out because it blew apart when it got close to the sun. But what's November 28th, 2013? Well, you're all students of the Bible. Now, there are different feasts of the Bible, but there was one feast that didn't become a feast until about 162 or 63 BC under the Maccabees, and that's the Feast of Hanukkah. November 28th, 2013 is, guess what? The first day of Hanukkah. Now, does that mean something's going to happen that day? I don't know. But as Mark Bilt said last night, maybe Jesus is going to light the first candle at Hanukkah. The Comet. I don't know. It'll be interesting. The point that you need to do, the point that you need to remember is that you need to be watching. You need to be in the Word, studying the Word, and knowing that God is going to do things in the near future, I believe, that will be associated with the Lord's feast days, the Lord's days of divine appointment. And he's going to do that so that the faithful remnant will not miss what's going on. It is our duty to understand those days, when they are, and to be ready. Because on one of them, Jesus will return. Another one, he will return at the end. And I don't think there's any question but that's associated with the Feast of Trumpets. We know when he's coming back. We just don't know the year. But we know all these things are going to happen. And a lot of them are tied to feast days. And we'll look at that as we finish up our study in Revelation. There are things that are clearly tied to feast days throughout the book of Revelation. And if you understand that, then you have a better idea of what's going to happen and when.